So those are my quick welcome remarks. I do want to take a moment and introduce Clay Richardson, Principal Analyst at Forrester. What I really enjoy working with Clay on is he's not always been an analyst. He has been a practitioner of business process management. And he has worked for vendors, he's worked for service providers, really starting with being a director of professional services at Handysoft, which is one of the business process management solutions, to being the practice lead at Project Performance, to then moving over to Forrester to analyze the market. And Clay and I have gotten to know each other over the last couple of years, and his approach is a real practical approach to BPM, and that's why I thought he would be the best person to come and talk to this audience today and give a little insight in what's disrupting the BPM market. So on that note, Clay, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. It was a really nice introduction. I need to take you with me to other events. I don't know if the mic is hot. The mic is hot. Doesn't sound hot, but.
No amplification in the room, but it's
Okay. Okay, so it's a really good setup. Before we get started, though, I want to ask you, how many of you are familiar with the show Breaking Bad? There's people that haven't seen Breaking Bad yet? Like, you gotta get with it, man, right? And I remember one of my colleagues, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago, was telling me about this show, Breaking Bad. And I was just like, dude, you need to get a life, right? Until I started watching the show. And the show is very addictive. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's basically about a high school chemistry teacher who has terminal cancer and basically starts cooking meth to leave money for his family. That doesn't sound connected to BPM in any way, does it? But when I started watching Breaking Bad, I did get addicted to it, and I was doing this binge watching, and I was just more amazed at all the disruptions that would come in on the main character, Heisenberg. I prefer to call him Heisenberg and not Walter White. But I was just amazed at the disruptions that would come in, and he'd overcome all of them, somehow, miraculously, right? And it really made me think more, when I look back at the different episodes, it makes me think about the business environment we're in today, right? Constant disruption, right? I remember I was at an event, another vendor event, a couple weeks back, and they were asking me, what does transformation mean, right? What does that mean in general? When someone says transformation to you, Clay, what is that about in a business context? And I said, well, the reality is it's hard for companies to do transformation the way we thought of it 5-10 years ago, right? There's always something happening and coming in, right? One of my coworkers, she has a really good term that she calls continuous delivery, right? It's not about, okay, we're going to transform and then we get from point A to point B and then we go on to do this next transformation. It's really about this continuous stream of stuff coming in. There's really no point A or B. You're really adapting and changing as new things come in. And that's why I love to use the Breaking Bad example for where business is today. That's how businesses have to operate, is constantly adapting to disruptions all the time. How many of you agree with that? Oh, wow. I asked that because I could see everybody's face. I don't know if this afternoon people are like, Clay, what are you talking about, right? And sometimes I do, when I do presentations, some people in the audience kind of say, well, that's not my industry, right? But those are usually the people that were at Borders anyways, that's mean. Sorry. But that is the case, right? I mean, we know disruption is happening constantly. We know that companies from one industry are jumping over into other industries, right? So if you think about Amazon, Amazon started as a bookstore, online bookstore. What is Amazon today? What are they? Everything. I mean, they bought Bezos purchased, acquired Washington Post. But in general, they're a little bit of everything. They find the opportunity, they move in, and that brings disruption to these new markets. And so, just to get started here, how many of you are here for more on the BPM side, business process management side? Just hands up high, don't be shy. Okay, don't be afraid. How many are here more for app dev, from an app dev perspective? Why is everybody else here? What did I see? You just showed up in front of the hotel and came, right? So just, you heard Mac talk about my background. My background is developer. So the first job I had was as a developer, rolling up my sleeves, doing, for those of you that are developers in here, Delphi developer. So I'm going way back, dating myself really. But then over time, I started getting involved with business process management and working with the business. And so I really balanced both of those worlds from a development standpoint, but also working with the business with business process management. And so if we go back 5 years ago, if we get in a time machine and go back and look at business process management 5 years ago, it really looked like this, right? Someone in front of a whiteboard, mapping out and modeling out business processes and trying to define the universe of what an end-to-end process looked like. What do you think today, if we fast forward? Now, Max said I was practical. A lot of this presentation will probably not be practical, but it's really a lot of what we want to talk about in this session is what does the future look like, and why are tools like Bonitasoft becoming more critical to moving into this future? So what do you think processes look like today? What's that?
They're automated.
They're automated. But let me, in this environment in 2007, this is me, pretend like this is me modeling out a process, right? Somebody says, okay, next step, in this next step, I want the screen to be green, or I want the screen to have a colorful button. What do you think I would say to that person in terms of the process modeling session? What do you think I would say?
It's a detail.
It's irrelevant, right? The color of the screen has very little to do with the process, right? Usually I would say, let's put it on the parking lot, right? We'll come back to it, or maybe not, right? And the key here is when we fast forward to today, a lot of it has shifted. When we start talking about process, it really is more about the experience. What does the user experience look like? How do I design a compelling user experience? How do I make it easy and convenient to use? And so when we start looking at where business process management is going, a lot of it is more focused on creating compelling experiences for the customer and for employees. So it's becoming less about let's automate everything, right? Automation is still important, but it's more about how do we make it more convenient, right? And so the reason I set this up, I don't know how many of you have heard we're in the age of the customer. How many of you agree with that statement? Okay. Who doesn't believe we're in the age of, what age do you think we're in? I'm just messing with you. I'm just messing. No, I'm just messing with you. I didn't see your hand go up. I have to pick at people. I have to stay awake up here too, right? So the key here though, and I was skeptical of this, I'll be upfront with you. When we first came out, Forrester, when we came out with this idea, notion of the age of the customer, I'm like, yeah, right. This is just another label. Customer has always been important, right? But when we look at these big shifts, and when we use the term the age of, that usually means it's a 20 to 30 year cycle where competitive advantage will revolve around that. The most revenue, let's say, or cost, value, will be centered around that particular element. And so if we go back, we know 1900s, early 1900s to 1960, age of manufacturing, 1960 to 1990, age of distribution. So really using global connections to move things around the world. So supply chain management. Age of information, 1990 to 2010, right? And now we're moving into this age of the customer. And what's driving this a lot, I don't have my phone, but is mobile, is social, is people being able to actually have more power as they interact with companies. And we've never had this level of power when I think about it in terms of interacting and engaging around products and around companies, right? How many times have you gone into a store and looked at a product? I got my phone out too early. How many times have you gone in a store and looked at a product, and while you're trying to figure out, should I buy this product, you go and look up the reviews on Amazon for the same product, right? I do that all the time, right? So if you think about before, all I really had was the commercial and my friends' word of mouth, right? But now I have the world to give me feedback around a particular product. And when we talk about disruption, a lot of the disruption we see is coming from this, right? So when we talk about processes changes, processes being disrupted, it's as a result of the age of the customer, mobile, definitely social, cloud, all these different things, but a lot of it is centered on customer drivers, customer needs. And so if we look, I wanted to bring some data just to show you some of the trends that we're seeing. I hope you can see that okay. But what we wanted to, a question that I asked a few quarters back this year is just trying to get a sense of what are the drivers for BPM adoption, for companies buying BPM. What do we see as some of the new drivers, some of the existing drivers? And what was amazing is looking at things like extending critical business processes to mobile. So going out to the customer, getting processes more mobile enabled, we saw, if you look at this, the dark green represents significant increase. As we go forward, lighter green, moderate increase, and then the lightest green, we see decreases, right? So extending business processes out to mobile, we see where companies are doing significant work to drive processes out to mobile. BPM methods to improve customer-facing business processes, 29% saying significant increase, 42% saying moderate. Connecting business process improvement with big data, that's another piece we know is a big driver, and a lot of this is when we talk to customers, our customers, talk to people like you, about the connection between big data and business process management, a lot of it is about gaining better insights into customers. What are customers doing? What are they buying? How do we connect those insights into driving better experiences? To give you a real world example, a telecoms provider that I was working with, they're using big data and process to get insights, and a lot of what they're trying to do is drive greater revenue per agent, right? So they're saying if we can get insights on how the best agents are working, we can change processes and actually get average agents able to deliver at the same level. And so that's for call agents, right? Another area we see is extending package applications using BPM. This is a big one. How many of you have a package application like Siebel or SAP? I know more people than that, right? You don't have anything even close to SAP? Sorry, I have to ask, right? Most companies have some package application that's very static. Processes are pretty much well-defined. And so what we're seeing companies do is use BPM as a way to extend and bring greater flexibility to these package applications. And then, of course, moving critical business processes into the cloud. And these are non-traditional. Most of these are non-traditional uses or new use cases coming in for BPM. But we can see that a lot of this is being driven by customer demand and customer need. And so the key here, though, when we start talking about the customer and looking at improving processes for this customer engagement, delivering customer experience, it's a different paradigm. It's a different world, right? How many of you have some sort of BPM program going on or process improvement program going on in your company today? Okay. So typically, I'll ask Vijal? Viral, got it. I'll ask Viral, that's an interesting name, by the way. So I'll ask Viral, typically when the business comes to the process team and says, hey, we need to get some work done, what sort of challenges are they trying to solve? Just give me an example.
Most of the time it's associated with streamlining the process and also lowering the cost base.
Streamlining the process, lowering the cost base. What else?
Controlling risk and auditability.
Controlling risk and auditability, right? Anybody else? That's a good one, by the way. Interoperability. Those are classic BPM use cases, very well proven, right? And that's usually dealing with the back office and operations. And so when we look at these common challenges, how can we optimize the business, right? Improve the business. How should we respond to competitive threats? This is another one that's very common for BPM. How do we actually bring BPM in so we can become more competitive, whether that's from cost standpoint or not? What best practices should we adopt? How do we begin to institutionalize the way that we should run the business? when we start talking about customer experience, it's a very different conversation, and the challenges are very different. If we look in the front office, what sort of challenges do you think the front office needs to solve? Anybody?
How do you make things easier for the customer?
How do you make things easier for the customer, right?
Cross-sell, upsell.
Cross-sell, upsell, right? Anybody else?
Surveys.
Customer surveys, customer sat, right?
Customer self-service, too.
Customers, that's the convenience thing.
Convenience.
That's really good, yeah. So let's look at what we see in the front office. What will the future customer look like, right? That's a very different question that really, traditionally, BPM is not designed to answer. How do I find meaning in the work I do? This is a weird question, right? It's kind of like, what does that mean? Well, think about at work, as you're trying to complete a task, right? You're trying to get a task done, and you're banging your head thinking, who designed this process this way? Why is it designed in a way that really I have to twist my arm around my back? And this actually contributes to me. I have to share with you a funny, really interesting story. So a client that I'm working with, was working with, helping them architect the replacement of a legacy application, right? So we're talking to the crowd, the audience. We have system architect who built the legacy application in the room. And we also have the users that use the application on a day-to-day basis in the room. And so I'm showing this section just saying, hey, you know, a lot of how the system's been built has been here. We need to shift the thinking and really bring in the right tools, the right techniques to start developing the new system more over here. So the architect in the room kind of raises his hand and says, really, this side doesn't matter because we built the system so the person doesn't even have to think, right? And I was like, okay, this is interesting. This is going to get really good, right? And the user on the other side didn't say anything, right? Just kind of was like, yeah, you're probably right. What was interesting to me is I just finished interviewing the day before the business users and learned that the business users are actually reprovisioning, reallocating fields in the existing solution. What does that mean? You're basically putting data in fields to mean something different from what the architect had originally designed the system for.
I see that disconnect all the time.
It kind of blew.
Sometimes you have an application where people are still using sticky notes because the application doesn't do it the way they want to.
I wish I could take my jacket off, but I have this mic on. But you're spot on. Where in a way, this disconnect is really the employee is saying, you know what, I know I'm not going to really get what I want. I'm going to keep reprovisioning and really building my own system, kind of hackneyed, if you will, on top of what's already there, right? And it was just amazing to have that conversation and see the architect really was just saying, hey, the system is built the way it is for a reason. And the person on the other side is saying, I'll make it do what I need it to do. But the problem comes in when people leave the organization, right? And these fields are just floating out there and the sticky notes are kind of on the side of the desk, right? And this is why this piece is really important. How do I find meaning in the work I do? When I interviewed the business users, they were literally banging their head in terms of how many clicks I got to go around to get places. I mean, it's a very common problem that normally we don't really address, right? Because we're focused on this side. How do you put a dollar amount on how do I find meaning in the work I do, right? How do you build a business case around that? In most cases, you don't, right? But this is becoming more important, is this shift. And then another one is, which competitors should we partner with? So this is one that I see for different companies that we work with where they're trying to look at their ecosystem and figure out how do we build solutions that allow us to bring partners in that may actually be competitors so they can only see certain things and do certain things, right? And so it's a very different way of architecting and thinking about process development. And so when we do this, the primary reason I wanted to show this contrast is a lot of where BPM has been on this side, has been on the automation, back office. Where we're seeing customers begin to go with BPM is more on the front office side, right? Still, those two things usually need to connect, but we're starting to see the need for new tools and new techniques to deal with the challenges on this side, new thinking. So I don't know if it's after lunch, or it might be me because I haven't had espresso, but is everybody good? Okay, we might have to do a get up and stretch thing at some point, but I think we'll be good. So this is the model that we see emerging going forward, is back office services, basically to connect and interact with back office systems, but front office applications that support customer-facing applications, right? So it really becomes where we see BPM beginning to move is more in this space to be able to focus on designing processes for engagement, designing better experiences around BPM. And what I did, just to give you some ideas, there's two things I want to do as we walk through. Number one, I want to talk about some of the new techniques and the new thinking that you want to start adopting around process change, right? That's number one. So I'll take a second and walk you through what we found as critical to moving on to the other side. The second thing I want to do is talk about the technology, right? What type of technology do you need to start building these sort of customer-facing apps that connect to the back office also? And so what I did, this is, just to give you a little bit of context, I started this research last year as part of trying to understand how do processes need to change as a result of mobile. And a lot of the information that was out in general thinking was, hey, I can actually just buy a mobile app and I just put my process behind that and we're all good, right? Not a lot of work needed. What really got me going around the mobile thing, just to give you an idea, is I was chaperoning a slumber party for my 11, she was 10 at the time, 10-year-old daughter, right? Bunch of screaming girls. You know, you guys were like, where's this guy going, right? Bunch of screaming girls. And at one point, I needed to order food, right? I needed to order pizza. So I was thinking, okay, it's going to be hard for me to get on the phone and call Pizza Hut. Why don't I just use my phone, download the app, and then I'd be able to order the pizza, download the app in maybe like a minute, then order the pizza. You know, how long do you think it might take to order a pizza from Pizza Hut via their app? Anybody? Actually, I thought it would take 5 minutes. It took me 20 minutes. And what I realized is they really had not optimized the process at all for mobile, right? Ultimately, what they've done is taken their web-based order process and basically said, hey, we're going to put this on access for mobile. Like, it wasn't a nice app. The app was actually really nice, but it didn't take into account any context, any form factor context, right? So now I'm on my mobile phone trying to build a pizza with my hands, right? Because that's how their web-based app is, right? Is you build a pizza kind of interactively. And it got me thinking, businesses, companies really need to take time to think about the device itself and actually redesign the process and task for the device, right? And so started doing this research, and it led me to this, to start looking at and thinking the reality of this is it's not just about redesigning processes for mobile, right? Mobile is that catalyst that gets people saying, okay, we got to rethink. But when you start thinking about what the customer experience needs to be, everything will be designed for mobile, whether that's a tablet, whether that's a smartphone. At the end of the day, we have to rethink how we design for mobile, but for web, for all channels, right? And so, sorry, I wanted to give you the backdrop there, but moving forward, what I realized, a lot of companies that were doing mobile development, mobile app development and dealing with process, they were actually using outside third-party agencies. So these IDEO, the design agencies building these apps. And I started thinking to myself, the best thing app dev and business process people can do is start adopting the same techniques that these design agencies use, right? So I said, you know, I like to think I'm a smart guy, but I also don't mind robbing from people. So, or stealing ideas. That sounds bad. But what I ended up doing is, so I decided, let me go interview these design agencies to understand what techniques do they use to design these compelling user experiences and these compelling products, right? And so when I went out, these are the different agencies that I interviewed. So this is a handful sampling of the different agencies I interviewed. So I asked them 2 questions. First question was, what methods do you use when you're working with the business, when you're working with the chief marketing officer? What methods do you use to design very compelling experiences? How do you do this? The second question I asked was, who within IT, within the IT department of your client, who do you work with? Who do you partner with? You know, do you partner with the business process team? Do you partner with enterprise architects? You know, who do you partner with? So what do you think the answer was to the second question of who do you partner with? Yeah, definitely partner with the business, but who within IT? Who?
Nobody.
Nope.
Nobody.
Nobody.
No, I totally isolate them.
Here's what was amazing to me is a couple of the calls, the answer was we try to avoid them, right? And I was like, whoa.
I'm not saying right or wrong, but that's the reality.
That's the reality. But what it brought to me, so that was the first answer was really, we don't work with internal IT, we try to avoid. The second question that I asked around what methods, I'll talk a little bit about that, but let's kind of peel back this we avoid IT response. So that's from the design team or the design agency's perspective. When I talk to the enterprise architects and say, you know, and app dev, everyone within IT, when I talk to them, I say, well, do you get involved in these projects? And the answer is no. Rarely do we get involved. The only time we get pulled in is 2 years later after it's been put into production and we need to clean it up, right? And so a lot of my questions began to look at, okay, if that's the case, how do we get in front of this? How do we actually start thinking from an IT, or as Forrester, our term, or the general term is business technology organization, how do we actually begin to get in front of it and get more engaged around some of these activities when they're just beginning to start? And so what it really left me when I was talking to these guys, I started developing this picture. I don't know if you can see that well, but it just reminded me of the days when I was in grammar school and 2 captains had to pick a kickball team, right? And it was almost as if the IT team was not getting, or people in IT aren't getting picked for these sort of activities, right? So it's how do you begin to get picked for the team? That's part of what we wanted to answer through the research. And what I found is, this is an important concept. How many of you have heard of design thinking? This, I think, for business technologists, no matter where you sit, whether you're app dev, business process, whether you're testing, this is one of the most important concepts to start taking in and adopting, because it's really, when I talk to these design firms, what I heard is IT needs to shift to be able to shift to creative experimentation and identify with customer experiences, right? That was the big thing that I heard consistently as I went through these conversations. And what it brought me to is really this need to be able to experiment and work through problems, not using deductive logic, but actually using more of an experimental approach. And so let's dig into this. But like I say, this, and I want to be careful here. Forrester did not invent this term. I do not claim to have invented this term. The definition we have here is Forrester's definition from a business technologist's perspective, as opposed to a designer's perspective. And that's what we wanted to do, is give a definition that shows what does the business technologist need to do? What does app dev, business process need to do? So let me show you the contrast. I think this is what helps people kind of get it here. A lot of the way we problem solve as technologists is around systems thinking, right? So thinking holistically, thinking more deductively. So looking at problems from a holistic perspective. When we shift to design thinking, a lot of designers, like people who design cars, design new products, that sort of thing, a lot of times they're thinking of a specific thing. They're looking at specific interaction points. How do I design for that individual interaction point, as opposed to saying, let's build the entire thing, right? If you think about, I guess a good example, you got to keep me honest on time here, because I will. But a good example is, if you think about different cars, let's say a Range Rover, right? I was going to use a Prius, but I figure I'll use the biggest gas guzzler out there, right? Range Rover is really designed around a simple concept: luxury for the outdoors, for the rugged life, right? Which sounds weird, but that's what the Range Rover is designed for. I can take my very nice leather car or leather chaired car, expensive car, out off-road and go four-wheel driving, right? And they designed the car around that specific interaction point, not trying to design for everything else, right? And what that really means is, guess what? I'm paying, probably $120 per fill-up, right? Because they're not concerned about making it all work. Just, we need to get these pieces working to meet this particular customer need, right? And that same thing applies to when we start thinking about the systems that are designed around these sort of practice. We're looking at specific interaction points. If you think about Facebook, it's about the like, right? If you think about other systems, it's around a specific interaction point. When we go to systems thinking practices, it's about linkages. We're trying to link everything together, relational database, right? When we go to design thinking, it becomes more about context. How do I drive greater contextual awareness to actually get people to the outcomes that they want? Logic in systems thinking, deductive reasoning, logic. Instead of logic, we move to empathy. I think this was the hardest thing for me to understand. When I talked to these different design agencies and they started talking about empathy, I kept thinking, like, I understand empathy. I'm empathetic. I feel sorry for people, right? But I'll talk in a second about what that really means in terms of application development and designing business processes. And then deductive, what I heard a lot was this concept of abductive. How many of you have heard of abductive reasoning? Good. I usually have one person, so sometimes when I'm presenting this and I put that up, people start pulling out their phones and Googling abductive, like that's not a real word, right? And the idea behind abductive is, if we compare it to deductive, which basically says we're looking at past events to figure out what will likely happen. And so that gives us a way to build best practices, right? When we start talking about abductive logic, we're really saying we're assuming we don't know and we don't have access to past data, and we're going to brainstorm, it's a fancy word for brainstorm, on what the possible scenarios might be for solving this problem. It's really experimentation. This is a good example of abductive would be the iPhone, right? If you think about, the classic, I'm not promoting Apple or anything, I have an iPhone, but the classic Jobs quote is, if I would have asked the market what they wanted, then they would have gotten a big, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it would have been a big phone with, all these crazy apps, right? Or a big crazy cell phone. And so abductive is saying, imagine a future that doesn't already exist and then building towards that. So when we look at design thinking, a lot of this is about combining context, situational awareness, and prediction. So really being able to look at different personas, different people that might use an application. We may look at some of their history, but we're also thinking in terms of what some possible scenarios are that could come in the future. And then we're trying to identify what is the likely behavior. What are the things that person is going to want to do as they interact? Going back to this Pizza Hut example, right? So think about me on my phone trying to order pizza from Pizza Hut. My expectation is, and think about me as the person that also plays Angry Birds a lot. So I'm expecting a lot out of, I don't, but my daughter does. But I expect a lot out of my phone. It's supposed to be smart. So I look up, go to Pizza Hut, pull up my profile, actually log in, and I was expecting Pizza Hut would be able to see, number one, where I was located, number two, what pizzas I ordered from this location, and then be able to say, do you want to order these, the same pizzas? How many, right? Like to me, that's logical, right? And that's what we start getting to in this sort of environment, is this sort of situational awareness and trying to determine likely behavior. And so this is what design thinking is really about, is this contextualization. So let me go back to the empathy thing, because I think this is the hardest part for people to really understand. And it was for me, I'll be honest with you. Maybe, it's just I was moving slow at the time when I was doing these interviews. But it was really hard for me to understand because, again, I have empathy with most people and things. And one of the interviewers or companies I interviewed, they gave a really good example that brought it home for me, what's important here. What they shared is one of the IT teams that they worked with, they could see they had empathy. So the team had empathy, but the empathy was actually placed with the technology that they'd built, right? And I can definitely relate to this, right? I'm sure you guys can relate to this. We build systems. I fall in love with systems, right? But what they started sharing is they worked to get the team to empathize with the experience that the customer was going to have, right? And so moving more to this sort of scenario, right? How many of you have seen Undercover Boss, right? And so, in Undercover Boss, it really is the person, I had to get my time check. I'm not too smooth with that, am I? But the key is, for Undercover Boss, the boss goes in, gets to interact undercover on the front line, interacts with customers, and kind of comes to see that customers don't really like the product or the store. And also employees aren't necessarily happy. And so there are a few really good episodes I liked of Undercover Boss that really drove this idea of empathy home. But let me give you a real world customer example. So one of the customers we work with, we're helping them redesign their business process and really trying to look at the customer experience. And what we realized and what we learned is this was an insurance company, life insurance. When a customer or a family member loses their family member, someone loses a family member, the surviving family member beneficiary has to call in 14 times to close out the claim. Think about that. I got to call in 14 times, different units, to actually close out for someone that's just passed this close to me, right? The key was they wanted to figure out, how do we make this person a customer? The family member who's closing out, how do we actually get them to sign up and maybe use some of our services too? What do you think the likelihood of that person actually saying, I now want to be a customer after having to close out 14 different times? What do you think? 0, right? And that's really where the empathy comes in. Instead of designing the solution and processes around the systems and having empathy with the systems, the shift was, how do we design the processes around this customer's life event, right? And so that's a very big deal. So let's keep going. Another example client that we worked with in retail banking, and this was a really good example. How many of you have bought savings bonds? Nobody buys savings bonds anymore. So what we were doing with this client is trying to transform the retail savings bond purchasing experience, right? So go in, buy a bond. What they realized when we started working with them, average customer was 69 years old, right? So in general, the person buying savings bond, their market was dying out, right? It literally sounds kind of crazy. But what they wanted to do is shift to a younger customer. And so a lot of what we worked with them around the business process is looking at, what is the profile of this younger customer? What sort of things are they going to be doing? How do we need to design processes around this younger customer? One of the things that was really interesting, we did a persona exercise as part of their process design to identify this new saver. I think we called her Betty Saver or something like that, right? But Betty Saver on Facebook, uses very social, on Twitter, doesn't necessarily have a regular bank account, doesn't really save that much, right? It's kind of what you consider to be unbanked, but likes to give savings bonds to her nieces and nephews as gift, right? And by doing that, one of the things we're able to identify, both from an empathy standpoint, but also from a abductive logic, experimentation standpoint, is Betty, the saver, also wanted to be able to buy savings bonds off of Facebook. So to be able to gift, because she's social, off of Facebook. And that's part of that process redesign we couldn't get to if we didn't have empathy for this particular person, right? And that's something we normally don't do in process design. You don't see business processes try to take into account empathy for the person using the process, right? Or that end customer. How many of you actually think about that when you're doing process design? Consider empathy, which is good. How do you do it? That's the question too. How do you try to get that empathy baked in?
You put yourself in the shoes of the customer and try to do the thing that they're doing.
Okay. From a method standpoint, what methods do you use? Because I think about modeling, it's hard to capture that, right?
Call it walk the process or become
A day in the
that's
life.
gonna go through that.
That's really
that
good.
process.
So go with user and write user stories.
Okay, and with the user story, how do you capture let's say the empathy or the broader emotional impact, let's say? That's a little bit trickier. Right?
Observe what they do.
Right, observe what they do and capture it in. Do you actually write it down? Like, and the reason I'm asking the question like this, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the things we see customers doing this is very good, and this is best practice we're recommending that's evolving, is actually using customer journey maps in addition to process models. Because the journey map actually captures the customer's state. Like for each step in the process, you're really looking at, is the customer happy right now? Are they sad? What are they worrying about, right? And so it really gets you thinking, okay, what are the friction points in this step in the process that need to be redesigned? And that's really important going forward. And I'll talk about why, but that's a big piece that we see. One of the things I recommend going to this, what methods and techniques, we'll share with you this slide deck, but this is a table that I picked up from one of the companies I interviewed. That's too small? It's very small, sorry. I don't think I can zoom in, but I'll just walk you through some of them. But this was a really good table that showed how to go from an inside-out view when you're thinking about business process to a customer view, more of an outside-in view. And the idea here is things like, from an inside-out view, the business view of what the customer experience is or customer expectations. Business process improvement from an inside-out perspective actually is customer experience improvement from a customer's perspective. So it's really putting yourself in the customer's shoes, right? Focus on efficiency becomes focus on value creation, right? The model and the process is the subject. The customer and their life becomes the subject. This is actually pretty powerful. I did an exercise with clients around this, and we started looking at things that weren't included on this inside out, right? Yeah.
When I was involved in total quality management, where you have the different parties involved, and one of the parties is the customer.
Exactly.
So your voice of the customer
Exactly.
type.
Exactly. TQM is a perfect example of bringing the customer in. A lot of companies, when they implement TQM, don't always bring the customer in, right? And that's really, when you look at, it's very interesting, when you look at a lot of the methods around business process management, BPM, the original versions had some connection to customer. But when you're dealing with back office, a lot of times that perspective hasn't been needed, right? We're trying to cut costs. Where do we get the customer involved? The customer doesn't really care if you cut costs or not, right? They want a cheaper product, but at the same time, the customer's saying, well, go do that. Now, if you're talking about processes touching the customer, it becomes more important. And I say that because as I was doing this research, I was interviewing a BPM team, and one of the members pointed out that Lean Six Sigma has a design for Six Sigma capability, right? So you can actually use Lean Six Sigma to do some of these sort of practices, right? And so it's there, it's really how do you begin to revive it and actually make sure you're adding that. One of the things I want to just touch base on, how does risk, like if we think about risk, it's a very big driver in BPM, risk and compliance, right? If we think about risk from an inside out to an outside in view, how does that look? So from an inside out view, what is the view that a company might take about risk and compliance from inside out? What things might be the concern? We don't want to expose the customer's data, right? Personally identifiable data. Anything else? KYC, right?
Client onboarding, yeah.
Right? What about from an outside in view? What do you think from the customer? If you put yourself in the customer's shoes.
Security and privacy, I think.
Security and privacy? It's interesting when I started talking about this, someone brought up opt-in, opt-out. Right? From the customer standpoint, if you think about going to Starbucks and taking your phone and paying for your coffee, right? Like how many of you do that? Like pay for your, like I won't do that. I don't trust it. I think Starbucks might track me around. But the issue is having the ability to opt in or opt out, right? Where from a company's inside out view, it's really, we need to lock everything down because we don't want to go to jail, right? But from a customer standpoint, they may actually be okay with sharing information. In some cases, they have the ability to opt in, opt out. So last couple of things I want to shift to, last few slides here, is first, this sort of view that we're laying out, it really requires more of an emphasis on task design. And so instead of thinking about the end-to-end process and engineering all of the end-to-end, it becomes what are the 4 or 5 steps or key steps where I need to design the task to bring in context, to bring in content, focus on transactions, that is, and policies. And so a lot of what within Forrester, what we call atomization of process, right? Basically process design goes down to the task level and we start designing at the nano level, if you will. And this is really important driver going forward for business process. And what we see is 2 sets of process tools kind of evolving here or emerging. And so the first, what we call more BPM for transactions, is really more focused on high volume, transactional interactions, very structured, ideal for slower pace of change, and really tied to systems of record. If we shift this new type of BPM that we see evolving, and I include BonitaSoft as one of these newer types of BPM solutions, they're really geared towards some of the design elements that we were talking about before, developing solutions that are more contextualized and easier to change. So focus on delivering adaptive user experience. So I can change the experience based on what the user is trying to do. Targeting unstructured or semi-structured processes. This is where being able to track and view cases come into play. Ideal for faster pace of change. So we're trying to iterate this continuous delivery mindset. And then support for new work patterns. And so these new types of BPM tools are really critical to driving this type of engagement and customer experience that I've been defining. And so there's new metrics. I already talked a little bit about this. Things that we used to look at in BPM around cycle time now become more about convenience, right? So this is the outside in, inside out view. Adoption, instead of thinking about how do we get people to adopt BPM throughout the organization, it becomes more about how do we engage people? How do we drive rich engagement? Instead of exceptions, one of the things that we hear customers talking about, or managing exceptions, we hear customers talking about abandonment, right? And so my slide got a little bit screwed up, but what I wanted to point out here, just to close out, is your obligation. So what is the call for you after this event, right? What is the call to action? And really it's to begin understanding and engaging around customer experience, right? Even if you're focused on automation, you begin to think, how does this automation solution impact the customer? How do we improve this to drive customer engagement? The other thing is brute force coding is expensive and brittle. So when we start moving into these systems, think about building an adaptive system where you've hand coded everything and some disruption comes up and you have to go change. That's not really gonna work, right? And then introducing new technologies, that's the piece I had on the other slide. This data point that we have, I thought was really interesting and just wanted to share. We asked customers, this was earlier this year, asked customers whether they expect spending to increase for customer-facing applications and building these customer-facing applications. 58% agreed, 16% strongly agreed. The rest, there's different answers, but the idea here is overwhelmingly we see this shift happening over time. So we see customers investing in these applications for customer engagement and customer facing. And so with that, I think we're going to shift over for a second.
Yeah,
if there's any questions,
let's make sure we get them answered.
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of Q&A for you guys. Okay, good.
One quick question about the effect of like some of these things that are like empathy, but what you put yourself in user shoes, might be like look like a luxury UI or something like that that may significantly increase the design and implementation. So do you have any data point on like how that affects the overall like project?
Actually, it's interesting.
Can I play real quick, just for the online audience? Can you repeat the question?
So for the online audience, or for the question that was being asked is, how does some of this design thinking increase cost and potentially complexity for BPM, right?
In the long run, the initial stuff.
In the short run. What's interesting is, I don't have hard data, but what we've done, we have a couple of reports that look at companies that have begun to adopt these methods and techniques. And what we found is actually a lot of these techniques simplify development. So I'll give you an example, upfront development. So I'll give you an example. We just published a report for a VP, the title of the person is for a tech company, large tech company, the VP of process simplification we interviewed, right? And so we were saying, okay, process simplification, that sounds great, but what's the techniques? How do you simplify a process? And one of the things that she shared was, one of our techniques is to actually go out to the business and we put in front of them an iPad with the screen layout for a task in the process. We basically asked them, what data elements do you need to be effective to make a decision here? And so they're actually streamlining how many data elements are on the screen to make a decision to move forward. And so in that scenario, they're trying to take away some of the development, if you will. The other scenario that we've heard a lot is around this idea of co-creation, right? So bringing the business and IT together, our business and business process teams together to co-create and model out and define the solution. In those scenarios, it ends up reducing the amount of time it takes to actually deliver the final solution. But getting to the more empathy and context, right? I think that's the bigger piece that can drive up costs, is how do I build in situational awareness? And a lot of what we're finding is, it's kind of interesting, customers are trying to give a consumable way to navigate data to business users so that they can go and find some of the answers, but also be able to figure out what context really matters. And so some of it is self-service, but when we look at full-on bringing contextual guidance in, I haven't seen a big spike in development time, and a lot of it is because of the tools that are being used allow for some of that. Not all of that yet, right? If you're talking about real-time, predictive guidance, that sort of thing, that does drive up more richer skill set that's needed, right? Does that answer your question? Or does that get to it? So we haven't seen a big spike in complexity or development. So, any other questions? I saw a hand go up. Yeah.
You had abandonment listed as a task metric.
Say again?
You had abandonment listed as a task metric. He was like, can you explain more about what?
Yeah.
What you mean by that?
It's interesting. One of the clients that we work with is a retail company, large retail company, and they have their brick and mortar side of the company, and then they have their digital side. And one of the things we were talking about is their metrics around their process metrics for their digital side. And one of the things that they look at is how often is a transaction abandoned. So a customer started a transaction, they abandoned it. And what we started talking about is not just abandonment for a shopping cart, but when you start thinking about internal staff starting off a process and then not completing it or just giving up, right? And so it's really this idea of abandonment of shopping carts, but applied to broader process. Because if you think about it, I know a lot of you here, or when I'm talking to BPM audiences, a lot of times the alternative to BPM is spreadsheets or Microsoft Access or email, right? And so when you start looking at abandonment, it can be, well, someone started to kick off the process, but they actually decided, you know what, I'm just going to send an email, right? And so from that standpoint, it's really looking at these shadow processes that exist that aren't necessarily structured or really support collaboration is the best way to put it. So another thing I will say metrics wise, and we can close out, is I didn't have it on here. I kind of had his engagement, but one of the things we're also seeing customers begin to track is for the process is where's the person clicking on the screen, right? Because when we start talking about processes becoming atomized, right? And we look at the task level, it's important to understand how long is the person spending at a field level, how are they clicking around, and the reason I'm sharing this is the company, the retail company that I mentioned, their digital side actually tries to figure out if there's defects in a process at the task level if the person is spending too long on a particular field, or if they're clicking around and they're looking for something. They're literally looking at these micro pauses to figure out, is this task really optimized for what we need? So,
Okay.
all right.
Thank you, Clay.
Well, thank you. That was very quick. I think I could have kept talking.